Rev it up and welcome to Cars Yeah, show number 2525. Today we're going to have fun with an author who's written a book about somebody that maybe you've heard of. His name's Bill Sadler. Quite an amazing character. So be prepared to be inspired.
This is Cars Yeah, where you'll enjoy interviews with inspiring automotive enthusiasts. Mark Green is here to provide you with a fuel injection of automotive inspiration. So get in, sit down, buckle up, and get ready for a wild ride here on Cars Yeah.
Hello, inspiring automotive enthusiasts, and welcome to Cars Yeah. Today I'm in Waterloo, Ontario, Canada, with Ginger Baker Rust and a very special returning guest here on Cars Yeah by the name of John R. Wright. Hey, John, welcome to Cars Yeah. I should say welcome back to Cars Yeah. Do you have it in gear? And are you ready to release the clutch?
Yes, I am. Let's go.
All right. Now, I'll remind listeners that John was a guest way back. He was one of those guys that took a chance with some guy named Mark Green trying to be a podcaster. John was guest number 187 back in February of 2015. My, how the world has changed. And he's been a busy guy. In fact, he's written a very special book that we'll talk about here. But first, before we start the show, Ginger has a question for you that I didn't ask you last time you were on the show. So, Ginger?
Okay.
So, John, great to meet you. And again, I'm very honored and humbled to be able to ask you this and to be part of this today with you. So tell me, share something about yourself that most people may not know.
That I used to race, and my racing record did not bear looking at because I qualified mid-pack, and I probably finished mid-pack in most of my races, in club races in Canada.
What did you drive?
I drove a Canadian-built car called a Chinook Formula V, built by the Feature brothers in Toronto, Ontario.
Oh, well, the Formula Vs in the Sovereign group that I ran with back in the day, they were like a bunch of little honeybees flying around the track. Was it a big group of you guys and gals, perhaps?
Yes, there'd be about 30 people in their cars, and they all tried to win the race in the first lap. So you had to hang back and let the other fellows destroy themselves and drive around the fractured fiberglass and again finish mid-pack because the other guys held back too, and they didn't come together at the first term trying to win the race.
Well, I would think Ginger agrees with me. Just the fact that you were out there and participating, since Ginger's done some racing as well, that's all that really matters in that non-professional type of sport. Don't you think so, Ginger?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Well, it sounds like fun. Well, let me give you a proper introduction because we're going to be talking about a very interesting racer, a builder, a guy that worked in Area 51, involved in aircraft, involved with the CIA. This guy was quite an interesting fellow. So let's go. John Wright is an author and past racer who started driving in 1970. And after a self-described undistinguished record, which we heard about, and running out of racing funds, he switched from racing to writing about the drivers, the mechanics, and the builders in the sport. Initially, John's stories of Canadian drivers and cars were published in the Canadian publication Old Autos in Bothwell, Ontario, followed by the California-based magazine Victory Lane. Oh yeah, I remember Victory Lane. From there, other publications published interviews John was doing at vintage events, and things took off from there. John goes to vintage events around the country, including Mosport, Road America, Watkins Glen, and the Laguna Seca racetrack. He and his racing friends meet and talk about how fast they were, or maybe not. Today, he's here to share his newest book. It's titled Fast, Faster, Fastest, The Bill Sadler Story. And it's from our friends at Dalton Watson Fine Books. So, John, let's dive a little deeper into this book. And I want to start by asking you, why did you pick this book to write? And we're going to be diving deep into Bill Sadler's story because he was an amazing man. So how did this book start? How did it all come together?
Well, I was asked to meet Bill at the Canadian Motorsport Museum in Mount Hope when it was shared quarters with the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum. And so I drove down from Waterloo, and I met Bill, and he talked, and I listened, and I took notes. And then we decided to go to Merrittville Raceway, which was a dirt track racetrack, where a lot of Midwestern racers raced, Mario Andretti, Jim Hurtubise, etc. So we watched the dirt track racers, and Bill talked, and I listened. And this was in 2001. And it was determined that I would get a flight and fly to Arizona, where Bill lived at the time, and spend the weekend with him and take notes in preparation for a book.
This book, I'll tell listeners, this book is huge. It's 385 pages. So I would guess you had a lot more talks with Bill and other people after that, because this guy's life can't be captured in a couple-hour conversation.
Oh, no. And we spent the weekend in conversation at his home in Scottsdale, Friday night, Saturday night, Sunday morning, and we exchanged a lot of emails over the next few months. And I came up with a package that I pitched to Canadian publishers, and I could wallpaper one wall with rejection slips. No one was interested in this Canadian. So it just kind of lingered. The book lingered. And then there was an impetus about 3 years ago. And do you want to know about that impetus and who it came from?
Oh, of course.
Okay. It came from Dean Butler, who started Lens Crafters in the United States and who now lives in England and owns not only one of Bill's cars, a Sadler Mark III, but a number of other important vintage race cars as well. And Dean had some influence with Dalton Watson, and he persuaded Glen, who is the publisher of Dalton Watson, to take on the book. And there began a 3-year, literally full-time job of writing this book. And my wife helped immeasurably. I was the researcher, gathered the information. She was the organizer. And she and Jody Ellis, who laid out the book and who is a graphic artist, were as much responsible for the book as I was. It was really a team effort.
I'll tell you, Jody's been a guest on the show, and I've had many authors on the show who've done books that Jody's involved with, and she does such a great job. And that's one of the things I was going to say about this book for listeners is not only does it filled with the written information, but there's so many visual aspects, pictures. And did you have help going through to, I mean, Bill or his wife must have had boxes and boxes of photos.
Bill supplied a lot of photos. Some of his family members supplied a lot of photos. We purchased photos. Lionel Birnbaum, whose photos have appeared in many automotive magazines, supplied a number of photos. And the friend of mine, Ron Kilbisky, who's kind of taken over the curation of materials for the Canadian Motorsport Museum, supplied a lot of photos as well from his personal collection. And all kinds of photos of Bill's cars, wherever I went. Laguna Seca, Mosport, lots of photos.
So, John, after writing this book, what about Bill Sadler was so inspiring to you?
Bill was unique. He was cut from a different cloth. He was very bright. He was very opinionated. And he was very creative. And I found that interesting. And I found that he was the equivalent of a Colin Chapman and a Bruce McLaren all rolled up, and a Dan Gurney all rolled up into one.
Whoa.
And what inspired me was that he never really seemed to get the recognition he deserved. But on the other hand, he was sometimes his own worst enemy.
In what way?
In what way? He was very impulsive. He didn't suffer fools gladly. Actually, he didn't suffer them at all. And that got him into trouble with people who should have been his sponsors. And he should have been able to work with his sponsors to keep his Sadler cars going. But he left racing because he said, I could not stand anybody questioning my engineering decisions.
Oh, yeah. Well, I understand that he left racing, I think it was 61 or so,
Yep.
and he returned to school and graduated from MIT with a degree in electronic engineering. My wife has an engineering degree, and she said those guys and gals that study electronic engineering are the really smart engineers. And she was a mechanical engineering major, but she worked in civil engineering. Very good mathematician, but I understand he worked in Area 51 on advanced secret projects. Wow.
Bill told me he was working at General Dynamics, and he was, after a short period of time, he'd become the manager of a particular division. And two individuals showed up in his office, and they wanted to talk quietly. So he led them to an office, and they said, "Is this secure?" And he said, "Oh, yes." It was General Dynamics. I mean, it was a secure location to begin with. And they explained to him that he was wanted for secret projects that would be paid for in cash, and it would be a handshake deal only. There would be no signed contracts. There would be no paperwork at all.
What?
And that he might be called to come to a particular area and supervise these projects. So he was intrigued. To me, it sounds like something out of a John le Carré novel.
Yes.
Anyway, he was told to take a flight, but not directly to his final destination. He was told to take a couple of stops in between. And then he was advised to go to a particular hotel and stay. And then he was supposed to get up on a particular morning, stand at the corner, and wait.
Oh, my gosh.
So he waited, and a bus showed up. And this is in the book. A bus showed up with blanked out windows, except for the driver's windows, of course. And he got on the bus, and there were other people on the bus, but nobody spoke to him, and he spoke to nobody. And they drove to Area 51.
Wow.
And he was told he was going to be working on a super secret project. And here's what it was. There were a couple. There was a radar altimeter, and then there was a project that he was going to design ground-based penetrating radar that you would drag along the ground to locate Viet Cong caves in Vietnam.
Okay.
So he proved that the concept would work both for the radar altimeter and for the ground-based penetrating radar. And as one of his trips, he was told to go to Fort Belvoir and locate a hole that had been drilled into the ground, his words. And he found it perfectly well. So now ground-based radar, which was a super secret project in the late 1960s, is now used to locate the graves of indigenous children in residential schools in the United States and in Canada.
Oh, my gosh. Well, this is, the fact that he was involved in that, I mean, that's wild enough, right? But now you start to understand the mind of this guy. And I'll tell you, you mentioned how a couple people rolled up. And when I was reading part of your book, I thought, Dan Gurney, this is like Dan Gurney. The cars he was designing, the looks of the cars, the sports racers and things like that. So this was a bit of a Renaissance man. Can I say that about him?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
I think so. He had many flaws, as I said, but and I think one of his flaws was, he was too bright for some people. He had a lifetime membership in Mensa, which is a club for very few, very, very bright people.
Yep.
And you had to be on his level if you wanted to talk to him. And I wasn't on his level as far as engineering expertise was concerned, but he liked the fact that I liked listening to his stories.
When you're writing an autobiography like this, and you think about other people like Dan Gurney, and I've had many authors who've written autobiographies about very famous people. A lot of people go, "Who's Bill Sadler?" And when you're putting a book like this together, what would be, in your words, the biggest challenge or obstacle that you faced trying to write this book, or as you wrote the book? You did write it, so you didn't try, you did it.
Yeah. One of the challenges was everyone who knew Bill is dead, unfortunately, or they're in their late 80s.
That would make it tough.
So the market for such a book is really limited. But I didn't care. I wanted to pay tribute to an interesting Canadian. and be done with it. It was just, here's the book, read it or not read it. I guess that's my point of view.
Well, Ginger and I say read it because being fellow racers and automotive enthusiasts, this is the kind of person that after you read the book, you'll go, I wish I'd had a chance to meet him. And now, having spoken with you and read your book, I'm so much more upset that I never got him as a guest here. And I did reach out many times and try, but he was a rather shy character, or maybe I was one of those fools he didn't want to put up with.
But yeah, well, he went to England a number of times to work on Dean Butler's cars. He didn't want any help working on the cars. He preferred to work alone. He didn't socialize with Dean and his wife when he was there. They would have dinner together, I guess, and then Bill would go and work on the car some more, and then he'd go to bed. And he could be distant, but he could be all in as your friend, and he'd just talk your ear off.
Wow.
And I miss him. I miss him in a number of ways. When I went to Monterey and I talked to Greg, I was going to say his name, Greg. Anyway, Greg, mind fart. Greg owns his Sadler Mark IV that he built up for Greg.
Oh, okay.
And he teared up when he talked about Bill. He said he played tricks on him, and Bill would appreciated the tricks. And he was like a father figure to Greg. Greg Meyer.
Okay.
He got emotional when he talked about Bill. I wish I'd had more time to spend with Greg, but he had races to run and people to meet and whatnot. But interesting guy.
So as I was researching Bill Sadler, I mean, he's just extraordinary. Some of the information that I found, about him and some of his hobbies. I mean, he was also a ham radio operator and he was a pilot. And, going back and mentioning, what you said about the radars, that he was credited for two of the radars, forward-looking light attack radar and the alerting long-range airborne radar. And then he was he was also the founder of the Light Aircraft Manufacturing Association. And like you mentioned, he was a member of Mensa. And he also has 2 patents, 2 for continuous flow moisture analyzers. And, besides being, a car builder, an extraordinary car builder, he seems like from hearing, from you and different things I've been reading, he was somewhat, aloof, but he was just beyond an intelligence factor that I think, like you said, especially being involved in Mensa, that us ordinary people could actually even understand. But tell me, as you were researching and learning about Bill and talking to him, what surprised you the most about him and his career?
Well, I think I pointed out this in the book. He was like an iceberg. 9/10 of him was below the surface. And every time I scratched below the surface, I knew I learned something more about him. And I kind of went, wow, did he really do that? When he talked about, for example, being recruited by Turkish Aerospace in Ankara to travel to Turkey to build a prototype ground attack aircraft and fly it, I thought, this is something else. This is something else. This is beyond interesting. It just fried my mind that he would design and have built an aircraft and fly. He took it on its first flight, and that's when he found that one of his colleagues had put the center of gravity further to the rear than the design called for, and he had to push the stick full forward to get the aircraft to land on the strip. And fortunately, he had enough room to land the aircraft, and that airplane was so efficient, it carried more weaponry than it weighed.
What?
Like, for example, if it weighed 3,000 pounds, it could carry 6,000 pounds of armament. And that is unprecedented. I don't know of many other airplanes that could do that. I threw those poundages out there, but I don't think that's accurate. But it was a marvelous aircraft. And He designed it. He came up with the design. So what can you say?
He kind of reminds me a bit of Peter Brock as I became friends with Peter and started learning about his history and his involvement with hang gliders. Not as sophisticated as an aircraft, but hang gliders, and set world record hang glider height flying. So
wow.
Yeah, so these guys, Peter Brocks and the Bill Sadlers and the Dan Gurneys and Colin Chapman, of course, since I drove one of his cars. I like that guy, all about lightweight. I want you to answer this question, and I love the fact that you're a past racer and you love racing. What was one of Bill's cars that he built that you really felt attached to and as you learned about it and wish that you could have driven it and raced it?
Well, the Sadler Mark II is usually called the hero car because it won a major race at Watkins Glen, the Queen Catherine Cup in 1958. And in 2005, Wes Abendroth, who owned the car at the time, said, "You've got to come to Monterey because Bill's going to be there. We can hang out in my trailer and you can talk to Bill and, we'll just have a good time." And I did go, and that was the year that they featured the American Special.
What year would that have been?
2005.
Okay, that's the year I met him because I was racing there. Yeah. Okay, now it's coming together. Yeah, 2005. Yep.
Well, they were going to have a parade lap of American-built specials on the Sunday. And Wes said, of course, that Bill's going to drive the Sadler Mark II in the parade laps, and that you're going to ride in the car with him.
Oh, wow.
So here I am, and Sue's heard this story numerous times. I've got my legs wrapped around the roll bar brace. I've got my hat on backwards because otherwise I know it was going to be blown off by the wind. And the exhaust exited right below my left ear.
Oh, gosh.
And Bill fired the car up, and immediately I was experiencing deafness.
Yeah.
And we went out onto the track, and it was supposed to be parade lap. But Bill would let the car ahead of him get maybe 50, 60 yards away from him, and then he'd hammer the throttle.
Yeah.
And my eyes were watering because of the wind, and the noise was deafening, and I loved it. They almost had to drag me out of the car when we finished our laps. I don't know how many laps we did, 10, 15. And going down through the corkscrew at Laguna Seca, well, you've experienced it in a race car. I don't know how Can-Am cars raced there.
Oh, I know. Crazy, isn't it?
Their big block Chevys. Yeah. It was one of the most exciting things I've ever done in my life, and I'll remember it forever. And that Sadler Mark II, which is now in England, was marvelous. Marvelous car.
Wow. Well, as Napoleon Dynamite says, lucky.
So, John, this next question that I'm going to ask you, so I'm going to get a little bit in your head here. This question is not about what you want to be, but instead how you perceive yourself manifested as a vehicle. So here's this question. If you were a car that Bill created or raced, what would you be, and more importantly, why?
I'd be the Mark II because it was the car that won the most races.
Yeah.
And it beat Ferraris, Maseratis, Mercedes, Lister Jaguars. It beat them all.
Yeah.
And that was an accomplishment for a backyard builder who started out by building his cars by tracing marks on a garage floor with chalk, just like
Gurney used to do.
Yeah, just like Max Belkowski did.
Oh, sure. Yeah, yeah. Well, good answer to that question, and that's probably my favorite car of his as well. Although it's hard to choose with all the different things he was involved with. Well, we always ask our guests for a great book, and of course today the book you've got to buy is Fast, Faster, Fastest: The Bill Sadler Story by John Wright, our guest today. You can find it at Dalton Watson Fine Books. Just go to daltonwatson.com. You'll find a book there, but you know what? You're going to find a lot of other books there. They produce, publish, and print some beautiful, beautiful books. And do you know, I know they were offering 250 signed editions. Do you know if those are maybe still available, or if you are still available, John?
Sure.
All right. Well,
and if they're not, get the books to me and I'll sign them, and I won't charge your premium.
There you go. Just enough to race another car. Smart guy. Yeah, that's the way you can get back into the driver's seat. I'll put a link at the end of the show here, how you can get a hold of John if you want to reach out to him and so forth. So now we're going to have some fun, and Ginger's going to take you on what we call the ultimate drive.
All right. So, John, given you were a racer, if I could wave a magic wand and arrange for you to go on the ultimate drive in a Bill Sadler creation, what vehicle would it be, which we probably have already touched on?
I would like to try the Sadler Mark V that I think Julian Majib now owns in England. It was, I don't know as I would drive it as fast as it was capable of, because it did have front end lift. Brian Redmond drove it at Mosport at a vintage event, and he found that he had to be very careful on the back straight because otherwise he'd go flying. So I would drive it at moderate speeds around Mosport.
Wow. And what would you ask Bill if you had just one question for him?
What would I ask Bill? I'd say, Bill, what got you started? What really got you started in your enthusiasm for race cars?
If, since you got to talk to the man, do you have any idea where that all began, or is it a secret that is in the book?
Well, he got started with radios, and he had one of the mechanics at his father's shop, Sadler's Auto Electric, make him a crystal radio set. And then when TV came along, he went to a wharf surplus store and bought a radar tube, and he was able to convert it into a TV set.
What?
And then some reason, he got interested in cars. I think it started when his father was going to junk an Austin Bantam panel truck, and he cut it down into a roadster, and I think that put the bug in his ear with cars.
Yeah, and you got a picture of that in the book. I remember seeing that Bantam delivery panel truck, I guess, if you will. Funny little thing. And so he is just an amazing guy. And again, I'll encourage our listeners, get your hands on this book. I love reading autobiographies about people and how they developed what they did. And I think that all of you listeners will be shocked at this man, if you haven't already become a little more shocked about him and you didn't know about him by listening to us today, because, oh my gosh, quite a guy. Would you give our listeners maybe a parting word of wisdom or advice, and maybe with a little bit of Bill Sadler flair thrown in there?
Oh boy, Bill Sadler flair. Stick to your guns. Stick to your guns and do what you want to do. And don't let anyone tell you you can't do something.
That sounds like Bill.
Now, one thing I should add, Mark, you've got Canadian listeners, and there's a fellow that I'd like to plug.
Okay.
And his name is Gord Watley. He runs an online site for book selling, and it's called The Armchair Motorist. Oh. And if you're a Canadian citizen listening to this podcast, and you want to order a Bill Sadler book, it would be more advantageous for you to order it through Gord Watley and the Armchair Motorist than trying to go through the state. We've got a postal strike going on now here, so you're going to have to get it delivered by Purolator or someone. I don't know.
Well, I'll make sure I put a link to the Armchair Motorist on John's show notes page here, so you can, and specifically if you're a Canadian citizen, or can anybody in the world go to Armchair Motorist and order a book that way?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, you can.
Great. Are there some other ways that people can learn more about you, John?
Are there other ways that people can learn more about me? I guess you could try to find old issues of Vintage Race Car and Victory Lane and see if articles that I've written have turned up there. If anybody, I'm going to mention this to you, Mark. I'm going to start to email you some of the interviews I've done, ranging from people like let's see, Jim Rathman, who finished second three times at Indy and finally won it in a race-long duel with Roger Ward. Jim was a great interview. He also sold the original 7 astronauts their Corvette and became good friends with Gus Grissom.
Whoa.
So, so he was quite a character. And there were also, of course, Canadian race drivers that I've interviewed, but Dan Gurney was another interview I did when he was at the Toronto Molson Indy car race a number of years ago. Quite a guy, as we know.
Yeah.
Well,
Rathman.
Anyway,
Rathman won the 1960 Indy 500 and also the 1957, I think, a Monza race in Italy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's how I got hold of him, but because Bob McKee, who of the McKee race cars, crewed for Rathman. And when I talked to Bob, he gave me his contact information, and that's how I got hold of Jim Rathman.
Okay. Well, I see here he drove in 14 Indianapolis 500 races. My goodness. Wow.
Yes.
What a guy. Very cool. Well, I'll tell you, listeners, again, you can find everything on the Cars Yeah website, all the links to John. Are you still on LinkedIn, John? Can I put your LinkedIn account there if people wanted to reach out to you?
I can never remember my password for LinkedIn. So
lucky you.
They could contact me directly if
okay.
I don't mind giving out my email address.
Okay. Why don't
I think you have my email address, don't you?
Well, why don't you do that for our listeners right now? Let me know what that is.
Yeah. VintageJohn@Rogers.com.
Vintage John at Rogers. I love it. Very good. We'll put links, of course, on the show here. Ginger, any last questions for John before we let him go today and get ready for the new year that's coming?
Well, I just want to tell you that I'm really looking forward to reading your book. I haven't had an opportunity to read it yet, but I think it's going to be a fascinating read. And again, I want to thank you for allowing me to be part of this with you today, this very special podcast and listening to, and I look forward to reading your book.
Well, thank you, Ginger. I appreciate that coming from a seasoned racer like yourself.
There you go. A bunch of racers talking racing here. Aren't we having fun? John, I want to thank you for coming back on the show and being so generous with your time and sharing this amazing book about Bill Sadler with Ginger and I today. Until you and I talk again, my friend, Ginger and I will see you down the road, maybe at a racetrack.
Okay. You take care.
You bet.
Stay safe.
Yes, thank you, John.
You're welcome, Ginger.
For several years now, you've heard me talk about Linkage Magazine. I've been a subscriber since the start. Their talented and creative team brings you a spectacular publication and website that shares the automotive passion from a worldwide perspective. Linkage is about driving, restoring, collecting, and first-hand experience at collector car auctions and more. They bring you real-world values plus rational, experienced opinions on the current markets. They cover the automotive world and the people who share our passions. And Linkage Magazine has grown, mailing you 6 issues annually. Join me on this journey with Linkage. They're geared for the automotive life. You can subscribe at linkagemag.com. Today's vehicles are essentially computers on wheels, and it takes more than a wrench and oil to keep them humming. That's why Cars Yeah supports TechForce Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to driving tomorrow's workforce of skilled technicians forward. Techs keep our cars, trucks, airplanes, and fleets rolling. Yet there's a massive tech shortage because many young people don't know it's no longer a blue-collar job. Today, it's a new-collar career. It involves computers, technology, it's in high demand, you get paid really well, and you can live and work anywhere in the country. I know you're passionate about cars, trucks, and motorcycles, and you can help pass that passion on to the next generation of techs so our rides keep rolling down the road. Visit techforce.org today and learn how.
Thank you so much for joining us on today's ride here at Cars Yeah. Drive on over to carsyeah.com to find show notes and inspiring automotive fun. Download your free copy of Filler Up, a fun book filled with gorgeous photographs of fuel filler fun, including quotes from more inspiring automotive enthusiasts. Download your copy today, and we'll see you next time on Cars Yeah.